Okay, hello. At long last, I am not physically ill after school today. I am extremely tired, though. That's alright. Anyways, yeah, I'm reading 498 to 509. So, like 10-ish pages. And I'm not gonna read the Makers of America or the Very New Prince, because we have to read a lot of this. I have to do the second half of chapter 23, and then chapter 24, and there's a test on Friday. Yay! Okay, I'm on page 498 at Garfield and Arthur. Whew. Okay, Garfield and Arthur. As the presidential campaign of 1880 approached, Rutherford Hayes was a man without a party, denounced and repudiated by the Republican Old Guard. The Republican Party sought a new standard bearer for 1880 and finally settled on the dark horse candidate, James A. Garfield, from the electorally powerful state of Ohio. His vice presidential running mate was a notorious stalwart henchman, Chester A. Arthur of New York. Energetically waving the bloody shirt, Garfield barely squeaked out a victory over the Democratic candidate and Civil War hero Winfield Scott Hancock. He polled only 39,000 more votes than Hancock, 4 million to another 4 million. I hate reading these numbers. But his margin in the electoral column was a comfortable 215 to 155. The new president was energetic and able, but he was immediately ensnared in a political conflict between his Secretary of State James G. Blaine and Blaine's stalwart nemesis, Senator Roscoe Conkling. Then, as the Republican faction's dual tragedy struck, a disappointed and mentally deranged office seeker, Charles J. Guiteau, shot President Garfield in the back of the Washington Railroad station. Garfield lingered in agony for 11 weeks and died on September 19, 1881. Guiteau, when seized, reportedly cried, "I am a stalwart. Arthur is now President of the United States." The implication was that now the Conklingites would all get good jobs. Guiteau's attorneys argued that he was not guilty because of his incapacity to distinguish right from wrong, an early instance of the insanity defense. The defendant himself demonstrated his weak grip on reality when he asked all those who had benefited politically from the assassination to contribute to his defense fund. These tactics availed little. Guiteau was found guilty of murder and hanged. Garfield's death had one positive outcome. It shocked politicians into reforming the shameful spoils system. The unlikely instrument of reform was Chester Arthur. Observers at first underestimated him. His record of cronyism and fondness for fine wines and elegant clothing, including 80 pairs of trousers, suggested that he was a little more than a foppish dandy. But Arthur surprised his critics by prosecuting several fraud cases and giving his former stalwart pals the cold shoulder. Disgust with Garfield's murder gave the Republican Party itself a previously undetected taste for reform. The medicine finally applied to the long-suffering federal government was the Pendleton Act of 1883, the so-called Magna Carta of civil service reform. It made compulsory campaign contributions from federal employees illegal, and it established the civil service commissions to make appointments to federal jobs on the basis of competitive examinations rather than poll. Although at first covering only about 10% of federal jobs, civil service reform did rein in the most blatant abuses, yet like many well-intentioned reforms, it bred unintended problems of its own. With diploma federal posts now beyond their reach, politicians were forced to look elsewhere for money, the mother's milk of politics. Increasingly, they turned to the bulging coffers of the big corporations. A new breed of boss emerged, less skilled at mobilizing small armies of immigrants and other voters on election day, but more adept at milking dollars from manufacturers and lobbyists. The Pendleton Act partially divorced politics from patronage, and it helped drive politicians into marriages of convenience with big business leaders. President Arthur's surprising display of integrity offended too many powerful Republicans. His ungrateful party turned him out to pasture, and in 1886 he died of a cerebral hemorrhage. And the Blaine Cleveland Mudslingers of 1884. James G. Blaine's persistence in pursuit of his party's presidential nomination finally paid off in 1884. The dashing Maine politician, blessed with almost every political asset except a reputation for honesty, was the clear choice of the Republican convention in Chicago. But many reform-minded Republicans gagged on the Blaine's candidacy. Blaine's enemies publicized the fishy-smelling Mulligan letters, written by Blaine to a Boston businessman and linking the powerful politician to a corrupt deal involving federal favors to a Southern railroad. At least one of the damning documents ended with the furtive warning, "Burn this letter." Some reformers, unable to swallow Blaine, bolted to the Democrats. They were sneeringly dubbed mugwumps, a word of Indian derivation meant to suggest that they were sanctimonious, or holier than thou. Victory-starved Democrats turned enthusiastically to a noted reformer, Grover Cleveland, a burly bachelor with a soup-staining mustache and a taste for chewing tobacco. Cleveland was a solid but not brilliant lawyer of 47. He had rocketed from the mayor's office in Buffalo to the governorship of New York and the presidential nomination in 3 short years. Known as the Grover the Good, he enjoyed a well-deserved reputation for probity and office. But Cleveland's admirers soon got a shock. Resolute Republicans digging for dirt in the past of Bachelor Cleveland unearthed a report that he had been involved in an amorous affair with a Buffalo widow. She had an illegitimate son, now 8 years old, for whom Cleveland had made financial provision. Democratic elders were demoralized. They hurried to Cleveland and urged him to lie like a gentleman, but their ruggedly honest candidate insisted tell the truth. The campaign of 1884 sank to perhaps the lowest level in American experience as the two parties grunted and shoved for the hog trough office. The few fundamental differences separated them. Even the bloody shirt had faded to a pale pink. Personalities, not principles, claimed the headlines. Crowds of Democrats surged through city streets, chanting to the rhythm of left, left, right, left. Burn, burn, burn this letter. Republicans taunted in return. Mom, Mom, where's my pa? Defiant Democrats shouted back. Gone to the White House, ha ha ha. The contest hinged on the state of New York, where Blaine blundered badly in the closing days of the campaign. A witless Republican clergyman damned the Democrats in a speech as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, insulting with one swift stroke of the culture, the faith, and the patriotism of New York's numerous Irish American voters. Blaine was president at the time, but lacked the presence of mind to repudiate this statement immediately. The pungent phrase, shortened to RRR, stung and stuck. Blaine's silence seemed to give assent, and the wavering Irishman who deserted his camp helped account for Cleveland's paper-thin plurality of about 1,000 votes in New York State, enough to give him the presidency. Cleveland swept the solid South and squeaked into office with 219 to 182 electoral votes and 4 million big number to 4 million other big number popular votes. Old Grover takes over. Bull-necked Cleveland in 1885 was the first Democrat to take the oath of presidential office since Buchanan, 28 years earlier. Huge question marks hung over his ample frame, 5 feet 11 inches, 250 pounds. Could the party of disunion be trusted to govern the Union? Would desperate Democrats, ravenously hungry after 24 years of exile, trample the frail sprouts of civil service reform in a stampede to the patronage trial? Could Cleveland restore a measure of respect and power to... I can't read. Oh my god. Could Cleveland restore a measure of respect and power to the maligned and enfeebled presidency? Cleveland was a man of principles, most of them safely orthodox by the standards of his day. A staunch apostle of the hands-off creed of laissez-faire, the new president caused the hearts of business people and bankers to throb with contentment. He summed up to his political philosophy in 1887 when he vetoed a bill to provide seeds for drought-ravaged Texas farmers. Though the people support the government, he declared, the government should not support the people. As tactless as a mirror and as direct as a bulldozer, he was outspoken, unbending, and profanely hot-tempered. At the outset, Cleveland narrowed the north-south chasm by naming to his cabinet 2 former Confederates. As for the civil service, Cleveland was whipsawed between the demands of the Democratic faithful for jobs and the demands of the mugwumps, who had helped elect him for reform. Believing in the merit system, Cleveland at first favored the cause of reformers, but he eventually caved into the carpings of Democratic classes and fired almost 2/3 of the 120,000 federal employees, including 40,000 incumbent Republican postmasters, to make room for deserving Democrats. Military pensions gave Cleveland some of his most painful political headaches. The politically powerful Grand Army of the Republic GAR routinely lobbied hundreds of private pension bills through a compliant Congress. Benefits were granted to deserters, to bounty jumpers, to men who never served, and to former soldiers who in later years had incurred disabilities in no way connected with war service. A Democrat and non-veteran, Cleveland was in an awkward position when it came to fighting the pension grabbers, but the conscience-driven president read each bill carefully, vetoed several hundred of them, and then laboriously penned individual veto messages for Congress. Cleveland battles for a lower tariff. Cleveland also risked his political neck by prodding the hornet's nest of the tariff issue. During the Civil War, tariff schedules had been jacked up to new high levels, partly to raise revenues for the insatiable military in Republican hands, had profited from this protection, and hated to see the sheltering benefits reduced in peacetime. Oh, I skipped a line, sorry. Partly to raise revenues for the insatiable military machine, American industry, which was preponderantly in Republican hands, had profited from this protection and hated to see the sheltering benefits reduced in peacetime. But the high duties continued to pile up revenue out of custom houses, and by 1888 the Treasury was running an annual surplus accounting to an embarrassing $145 million. Most of the government's income in those pre-income tax days came from the tariff. Congress could reduce the vexatious surplus in 2 ways. One was to squander it on pensions and pork barrel bills and thus curry the favor with veterans and other self-seeking groups. The other was to lower the tariff, something the big industrialists vehemently opposed. Grover Cleveland, the rustic Buffalo attorney, had known little and cared less about the tariff before entering the White House, but as he studied the subject, he was much impressed by the arguments for downward revision of the tariff schedules. Lower barriers would mean lower prices for consumers and less protection from monopolies. Most important, they would mean an end to the Treasury surplus, a standing mockery of Cleveland's professed belief in fiscal orthodoxy and a small government frugality. After much hesitation, Cleveland saw his duty and overdid it. With his characteristic bluntness, Cleveland tossed an appeal for lower tariffs, like a bombshell, into the lap of Congress in late 1887. The response was electric. Cleveland succeeded admirably in smoking the issue out into the open. Democrats were deeply frustrated by the obstinacy of their chief. Republicans rejoiced at his apparent recklessness, bellowing loudly that lower tariffs would mean higher taxes, lower wages, and increased unemployment. The old warrior Blaine gloated. "There's one more president for us in tariff protection." For the first time in years, a real issue divided the two parties as the 1888 presidential election loomed. Dismayed Democrats, seeing no alternative, somewhat dejectedly renominated Grover Cleveland in their St. Louis convention. Eager Republicans turned to Benjamin Harrison, whose grandfather was former President William Henry Tippecanoe Harrison. The tariff was the prime issue. The two parties flooded the country with some 10 million pamphlets on the subject. The specter of a lower tariff spurred the Republicans to frantic action. In an impressive demonstration of the post-Pendleton Act politics of alliances with big business, they raised a war chest of some $3 million, the heftiest yet, largely by frying the fat out of nervous industrialists. The money was widely used to line up corrupt voting cattle, known as repeaters and floaters. In Indiana, always a crucial swing state, votes were shamelessly purchased for as much as $20 each. On Election Day, Harrison nosed out Cleveland 233 to 168 electoral votes. A change of about 7,000 ballots in New York would have reversed the outcome. Cleveland actually polled more popular votes, 5 million to other 5 million, but he nevertheless became the first sitting president to be voted out of his chair since Martin Van Buren in 1840. The $1 billion Congress. After a 4-year famine, the Republicans under Harrison licked their lips hungrily for the bounty of federal offices. They yearned to lavish upon the party faithful the fat surpluses produced by the high tariffs. But in the House of Representatives, they had only 3 more votes than the necessary quorum of 163 members, and the Democrats were preparing to obstruct all House business by refusing to answer roll calls, demanding roll calls to determine the presence of a quorum, and employing other delaying tactics. Into this tense cockpit stepped the new Republican Speaker of the House, Thomas B. Reed of Maine. A hulking figure who towered 6 feet 3 inches, he was renowned as a master debater. He spoke with a harsh nasal drawl and wielded a verbal harpoon of sarcasm. To one congressman who quoted Henry Clay that he would rather be right than be president, Reed caustically retorted that he would never be either. Opponents cringed at the crack of his quip. Reed soon bent the intimidated House to his imperious will. He counted as present Democrats who had not answered the roll, and who, rulebook in hand, furiously denied that they were legally there. By such tactics, Czar Reed utterly dominated the $1 billion Congress, the first in history to appropriate that sum. Sorry to spin my mouth. Congress showered pensions on Civil War veterans and increased government purchases of silver to keep the revenues flowing in, and to protect Republican industrialists from foreign competition. The $1 billion Congress also passed the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890, boosting rates to their highest peacetime level ever, an average of 48.4% on dutiable goods. Sponsored in the House by rising Republican star William McKinley of Ohio, the new Tariff Act brought fresh woes to farmers. Debt-burdened farmers had no choice but to buy manufactured goods from high-priced protected American industrialists, and were compelled to sell their own agricultural products into highly competitive, unprotected world markets. Mounting discontent against the McKinley tariff caused many rural voters to rise in wrath. In the congressional elections of 1890, the Republicans lost their precarious majority and were reduced to just 88 seats, as compared to 235 with Democrats. Even the much touted McKinley went down to defeat. Ominously for conservatives, the new Congress also included 9 members of the Farmers Alliance, a militant organization of southern and western farmers. The drumbeat of discontent. Politics was no longer as usual in 1892 when the newly formed People's Party, or Populists, burst upon the scene. Rooted in the Farmers' Alliance of frustrated farmers in the great agricultural belts of the West and South, the Populists met in Omaha and adopted a scorching platform that denounced the prolific womb of governmental injustice. They demanded inflation through free and unlimited coinage of silver at the rate of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. They further called for a graduated income tax, government ownership of the railroads, telegraph, and telephone, the direct election of U.S. senators, a one-term limit on presidency, the adoption of the initiative and referendum to allow citizens to shape legislation more directly, a shorter workday, and immigration restriction. as their presidential candidate, the populace uproariously dominated the eloquent old greenbacker, General James B. Weaver. An epidemic of nationwide strikes in the summer of 1892 raised the prospect that the populace could weld together a coalition of aggrieved workers and indebted farmers in a revolutionary joint assault on the capitalist order. At Andrew Carnegie's Homestead steel plant near Pittsburgh, company officials called in 300 armed Pinkerton detectives in July to crush the defiant Homestead strike by steelworkers angry over pay cuts. Strikers armed with rifles and dynamite forced their assailants to surrender after a vicious battle that left 10 people dead and some 60 wounded. Troops were eventually summoned, and both the strike and the Union were broken. That same month, federal troops bloodily smashed a strike among silver miners in Idaho's fabled Coeur d'Alene district. The Populists made a remarkable showing in the 1892 presidential election. Singing "Goodbye, Party Bosses," they rolled up 1 million popular votes and 22 electoral votes for General Weaver. They thus became one of the few third parties in U.S. history to break into the electoral column, but they fell far short of an electoral majority. Industrial laborers, especially in the urban East, did not rally to Populist banner in appreciable numbers. Populist electoral votes came from only 6 Midwestern and Western states, 4 of which, Kansas, Colorado, Idaho, and Nevada, fell completely into Populist basket. The South, although a hotbed of agrarian agitation, proved especially unwilling to throw in its lot with the new party. Race was the reason. More than 1 million Southern black farmers organized in the Colored Farmers National Alliance shared a host of complaints with poor white farmers, and for a time their common economic goals promised to overcome their racial differences. Recognizing the crucial edge that black votes could give them in the South, populist leaders like Georgia's Tom Watson reached out to the black community. Watson was a wiry redhead who could talk like the thrust of a bowie knife. He declared, "There's no reason why the black man should not understand that the law that..." Oh my god. Watson was a writer who he declared there's no reason why the black man should not understand that the law that hurts me as a farmer hurts him as a farmer. Many blacks were disillusioned enough with the Republican Party to respond. Alarmed, the conservative white bourbon elite in the South played cynically upon its historical racial antagonisms to counter the populist appeal for interracial solidarity and woo back poor whites. Southern blacks were heavy losers. The populists, inspired reminders of potential black political strength, led to the near total extinction of what little African American suffrage remained in the South. White Southerners more aggressively than ever used literacy tests and poll taxes to deny blacks the ballot. The notorious grandfather clause exempted from those requirements anyone whose forebear had voted in 1860, when, of course, black slaves had not voted at all. More than half a century would pass before Southern blacks could again vote in considerable numbers. Accompanying this distransference were more severe Jim Crow laws designed to enforce racial segregation in public places, including hotels and restaurants, and backed up by atrocious lynchings and other forms of intimidation. The conservative crusade to eliminate the black vote had also had dire consequences for the Populist Party itself. Even Tom Watson abandoned his interracial appeals and, in time, became a vociferous racist himself. After 1896, the Populist Party lapsed increasingly into vile racism and staunchly advocated black disfranchisement. Such were the bitterly ironic fruits of the populist campaign in the South. Cleveland and Depression. With the Populists divided and the Republicans discredited, Grover Cleveland took office once again in 1893, the only president ever re-elected after defeat. He was the same old bull-necked and bull-headed Cleveland, with a little more weight. Polish, conservatism, conservatism, and self-assertiveness. But though it was the same old Cleveland, it was not the same old country. Debtors were up in their arms, workers were restless, and the advanced shadows of panic were falling. Hardly had Cleveland seated himself in the presidential chair when the devastating Depression of 1893 burst about his burly frame. Lasting for about 4 years, it was the most punishing economic downturn of the 19th century. Contributing causes were the splurge of overbuilding and speculation, labor disorders, and the ongoing agricultural depression. Free silver agitation, the cry to expand the money supply with unlimited coinage of silver, had also damaged American credit abroad, and the unusual pinch on American finances had come when the European banking houses began to call in loans to the United States. Distress ran deep and far. About 8,000 American businesses collapsed in 6 months. Dozens of railroad lines went into the hands of receivers. Soup kitchens fed the unemployed, while gangs of hobos, tramps, wandered aimlessly about the country. Local charities did their feeble best, but the federal government, bound by the let nature take its course philosophy of the times, saw no legitimate way to relieve the suffering masses. Cleveland, who had earlier been bothered by a surplus, was now burdened with a deepening deficit. The Treasury was required to issue legal tender notes for the silver bullion that it bought. Owners of the paper currency would then present it for gold, and by law and by law, the notes had to be reissued. New holders would repeat the process, thus draining away precious gold in an endless chain operation. Alarmingly, the gold reserve in the Treasury dropped below $100 million, which is popularly regarded as a safe minimum for supporting about $350 million in outstanding paper money. Cleveland saw no alternative but to halt the bleeding away of gold by engineering a repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. For this purpose, he summoned Congress into extra session in the summer of 1893. Unknown to the country, complications threatened from another quarter. A malignant growth had developed on the roof of Cleveland's mouth, and it had to be removed on a private yacht with extreme secrecy. If the president had died under the surgeon's knife, his place would have been taken by the soft-money vice president, Adlai E. Stevenson, an eventuality that would have deepened the crisis. In Congress, the debate over the repeal of the Silver Act was meanwhile running its heated course. The silver-tongued young Democratic congressman from Nebraska, 33-year-old William Jennings Bryan, held the gallery spellbound for 3 hours as he championed the cause of free silver. The Friends of Silver announced that the hell would freeze over before Congress would pass the repeal measure, but it angered Cleveland to use his job-granting power to break the filibuster in the Senate. He thus alienated the Democratic civil rights like Bryan and disrupted his party at the very outset of his administration. Repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act only partially stopped the hemorrhaging of gold from the Treasury. In February 1894, the gold reserve sank to a dismaying $41 million. The United States was now in grave danger of going off the gold standard, a move that would render the nation's currency volatile and unreliable as a measure of value, and that would also mortally cripple America's international trade. Cleveland floated 2 Treasury bond issues in 1894, totaling over $100 million, but the endless chain operations continued relentlessly. Early in 1895, Cleveland turned in desperation to J.P. Morgan, the banker's banker, and the head of a Wall Street syndicate. After tense negotiations at the White House, the bankers agreed to lend the government $65 million in gold. They were obviously in business for profit, so they charged a commission amounting to about $7 million, but they did make a significant concession when they agreed to obtain one half of the gold abroad and take the necessary steps to dam it up in the leaky treasury. The loan, at least temporarily, helped restore confidence in the nation's finances. Cleveland breeds a backlash. The bond deal stirred up a storm. The Walgreen ogre, especially in the eyes of the Silverites and other debtors, symbolized all that was wicked and grasping in American politics. President Cleveland's secretive dealings with the mighty Jupiter Morgan were savagely condemned as a sellout of the national government, but Cleveland was certain that he had done no wrong. Sarcastically denying that he was Morgan's errand boy, Cleveland asserted, without shame and without repentance, I confess my share of the guilt. Cleveland suffered further embarrassment with the passage of the Wilson-Gorman tariff in 1894. The Democrats had pledged to lower tariffs, but by the time their tariff bill had made through Congress, it had been so loaded with special interest protection that it made scarcely a dent in the high McKinley tariff rates. In outrage, Cleveland grudgingly allowed the bill, which also contained a 2% tax on incomes over $4,000, to become law without his signature. When the Supreme Court struck down the income tax provision in 1895, the populists and other disaffected groups found proof that the courts were only the tools of the plutocrats. Democratic political fortunes naturally suffered in the face of these several setbacks. The tariff dynamite that had blasted the Republicans out of the House in 1890 now dislodged the Democrats with a strong helping hand from the Depression. The revitalized Republicans, singing "Times Are Mighty Hard," won the congressional elections of 1894 in a landslide, 244 seats to 105 for the Democrats. The Republicans began to look forward to the presidential race of 1896 with unconcealed glee. Despite his gruff integrity and occasional courage, Grover Cleveland failed utterly to cope with the serious economic crisis that befell the country in 1893. He was tied down in office by the same threads that held all the politicians of the day to the Lilliputian level, levels. Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Harrison, and Cleveland are often referred to as the forgettable presidents. Bewhiskered and bland in person, they left mostly blanks, or blots, on the nation's political record, as issues like the tariff, the money question, and the rights of the labor continued to fester. What little political vitality existed in the Gilded Age America was to be found in local settings or Congress, which overshadowed the White House for most of this period. Before the century ended, down-and-out debtors and disgruntled workers would make one last titanic effort to wring reform out of the political system in the momentous election in 1896. My throat. Okay, yay!